Warhammer price rises are something that seems to happen just about every year. There always seem to be something that cause people to be annoyed and catch them off guard when they happen. In this video I thought we could try and get ahead of the game a little bit and talk about Games Workshop's patterns of price rises over the past few years, a bit of a comparison to inflation, and maybe some of the most common talking points when they do inevitably raise prices again once more. Hello and welcome back to Warspecs Tactics, where today we're talking Games Workshop price rises. Jumping straight into it then, and here's just a very rough breakdown of their price rises over the past few years as best they could determine them. It generally tends to be something that they've announced and publicised each time when it happens, and all of these were in the post-Warspecs Tactics era, so I have wound up making videos on them at the time. Out of the past 5 years, Games Workshop have generally increased prices on their core plastic kits on 4 of those years, though each one of their changes have tended to have different nuances, some things excluded and then some things going up by more than you'd expect, and a whole bunch of regional variations as well. First up, we had one in June 2020 where it looks like their figures went up around about 6% or so. That's based on some slightly napkin math estimates, given that they didn't really give estimated figures for that one. Then in 2021 they skipped a year, which I think was due to the pandemic, maybe deciding that further price rises weren't the best idea right then, but certainly seemed to get back to it in the next few years. In March 2022 they announced price rises of around about 5%, though a few things like books, resin minis, scenery and metal miniatures went up by more. I believe they left Australia and New Zealand out of one of the more recent ones. I don't know if it was that one or the one previously, perhaps to try and stop them getting even more astronomically more expensive than they already are there. In 2023 it looks like they went up by around about 6% or so. That was excluding a few things like starter sets and paint pots, and in June 2024, the most recent one, they went up by around about 4%, excluding things like white dwarfs, paint pots, or black library things. In general, in the years where I've covered the price rises, they typically seem to be roughly in line with what they report, though it could be a bit nebulous as to exactly what one figure you should give any given price rise, given that some miniatures go up by a bit more and some by a bit less. They often tend to hop from one price bracket up to the next, and even if on average the changes did wind up averaging to 1 percentage point, it could still matter a lot more if, say, the most common things that people buy went up by more and the less common things went up by less. So I feel like it's always going to be a bit of a rough ballpark figure as opposed to anything too precise. Occasionally they have had some country-specific price rises as well, such as Poland and I believe Norway previously having some outsized increases. I think that often tends to be to correct for currency variations, where just over the years it's wound up that certain countries get Warhammer really quite a lot cheaper than others, and potentially it might mean that if you had sellers in Europe then they might be undercutting each other by quite a bit. As ever, it's basically seen as bad news by hobbyists in general. No one likes to see prices go up, and perhaps particularly so on plastic figures like Warhammer, where they're basically priced as a luxury, and the prices are kind of arbitrary and very divorced from what it actually costs to manufacture the things. Maybe a bit of a sense that Games Workshop's just increasing prices because they can and not necessarily because they have to. Whenever Games Workshop does choose to put up prices, they do generally tend to give the excuse of going up roughly in line with inflation. So I thought it could be interesting to take a look at the last 5 years worth of inflation and just roughly compare it to Warhammer prices to see what comes out on top. Obviously this is very uninformed napkin math, so don't read too much into it, but going from the USA and the UK for the past 5 years, taking the yearly percentage increase and then basically multiplying them on top of each other, it looks like inflation has made things go up by around about 23%-ish in the USA and 24% or so in the UK. Which, at least if those previous estimates are somewhat accurate, it does appear that they are around about the same sort of level as inflation in the last 5 years, around about 23% or so. Obviously over the past 5 years inflation has been kind of crazy though, a lot of it to do with the bounce back from the pandemic. There are lots of other things going into it. As I know, it can vary in different measures that you choose to use of it. I just went very simple and used the first ones I found on Google. I feel like I've seen the topic discussed over and over again over the years with various content creators or just people posting things on Reddit and looking at comparisons, and I feel like the vast majority of them have generally found that the Warhammer price increases tend to be roughly in line with inflation. Though that's obviously not to say that they're overpriced in any way. You could just say that they've always been pricing model soldiers and that's not changed in really quite a long time. And in any case, it's Games Workshop more charging what people are prepared to pay and what they think will maximise their returns. I was also interested to see if there'd be any difference between inflation figures and median wage growth as well, given that inflation's all well and good in theory, but if wages aren't increasing to reflect that, it doesn't necessarily make things any more affordable. Though at least going by some surface level figures in the USA and UK, it does seem to have been fairly reflective of inflation over that time, around about 23% and 27%, so Warhammer doesn't seem to be outstripping those in an enormous way, though obviously they're average figures and the case for any one person or any one community could vary massively. I didn't really go in looking for any individual outcome with those figures when I was trying to find them, just more out of curiosity and how they compared, and of course feel free to correct me if I made any major errors anywhere. I would bear in mind that there can be a whole bunch of other things at play though, as well as just price rises. Even if any one model kit is only going up in value in line with inflation, there's still other ways that Games Workshop could be increasing prices perhaps a little bit more stealthily. I feel like perhaps one of the most obvious ones is when kits are updated, they tend to be charged at a bigger premium than they were before. I think it's pretty rare that you see a model kit where Games Workshop takes away the individual model for an update, comes back with a newer, shinier, more detailed one, and then charges the exact same price for it. Generally speaking, they tend to go up and by quite a lot sometimes. There also does feel like there's been a bit of shrinkflation in some of the kits as well. It's really not uncommon for model kits to be coming with fewer models in the box than they did before. Maybe one good example of both of those in action could be the Tyranid Termagant update. They had some really quite old models which admittedly were lower quality, and before the update I believe they were £22.50 for 12 Tyranid Termagants in one box set, and then after the updates for the multi-part Termagant kit it went to £28 for 10 and a Ripper. Basically the kit costs a few pounds more, and you get one fewer model in the box set. Overall, on a per model basis, the price has actually increased a big 35% there, even if I would argue that the quality of the kit has gone up quite a lot compared with the old one that really needed an update. Just in general though, when they update kits, they can just gain a lot of price. Say for example, a Lehman Russ battle tank, including all the previous price increases, is now $70. The Sister Battle Castigator tank is a much more recent kit, but it is basically filling the same main battle tank role but for a different army, and that's $92 versus $70. I guess you could kind of look at that as sort of a 31% price increase that wouldn't normally be accounted for by their normal measures. Beyond that, I certainly feel like for some armies in 40k, you might need a fair few more models to play at say a 2000 point level than you might have needed to in the past. It definitely varies a whole bunch from faction to faction. Some things might have got a little bit better or a little bit worse. I do feel like for some armies though, they tend to be unusually cheap compared with where they used to be. Perhaps armies like Death Guard and Tau Empire being sort of bad examples at the moment, having some slightly lackluster rules at the start of the edition and having a bunch of points costs dropping by large amounts as a result. There's at least a fair selection of Games Workshop's more recent armies that tend to be some of the pricier ones as well. Sisters, Admech and Genestealer Cult are all very pricey to collect. Leagues of Votan maybe on the slightly upper end perhaps. There are a few counter examples as well like Adeptus Custodes, and World Eaters maybe aren't awful. But I feel like when Games Workshop releases new factions, for the most part they tend to be on the upper end as well, due to all the price points being at the highest ones they'd set them. In any case, model kit updates and everything aside, it does seem kind of odds on that Games Workshop is probably going to have a price rise in 2025, just because they tend to have one most years, and as a result it probably shouldn't be something that's really surprising people or catching them out so much. I don't know whether they will just be going as simple as looking at the last few months' inflation figures and deciding to base things off that, which if that is the case they might be a little bit more lenient than they might have been in certain years. It looks like inflation has got a fair bit more under control relative to the very high numbers we had recently, more like around about 2 or 3% in the USA and UK over the past 6 months or so. And I guess perhaps that could be some chance that the increase is a little bit smaller than usual or even postponed until next year, though I guess we'll wait and see. If we do get one this year though, it seems they usually like to put up prices either in March or June, as that's when the other ones have been. I guess due to their position in the year that might equate to their sales quarters. Maybe somewhere in Games Workshop they decide that we're going to raise prices for the next quarter and then put their plans into motion. In any case though, after having seen a fair few of these, it often tends to bring up the same sort of talking points when Games Workshop inevitably does put up their prices again. Often it can act as a bit of a trigger point where if budgets are already stretched, which from a lot of people they are right now, it can have people just deciding that they can't afford to keep up with the hobby or decide to pursue it in a more economical way for them. I feel like it could be a good jumping off point for people wanting to jump into 3D printing. I feel like I see quite a lot of comments with people saying that you can buy a basic entry 3D printer for a similar sort of price as a Combat Patrol box or a Battle Force these days. Obviously it's not quite the same thing, and some people like their crafted resin more so than plastic kits or the other way around, but we're definitely in a bit more of a day and age where there are other places that you can go to get your plastic or resin figurines, and Games Workshop isn't just the only option. Otherwise, it can trigger some people to look to slow down purchases if they want to limit rewarding Games Workshop for price increases. I'm sure there's plenty of folks out there who have more than enough of a big pile of potential to keep them going for another year or two with no other purchases necessary. I suspect I'd probably have to count myself amongst that if I dug out all the partially done projects out there. And in general, I feel like they're pretty reasonable responses. It probably doesn't hurt to have the community have a fair bit of pushback when price increases do happen, even if it's not going to be a make or break thing for literally everyone. I'm sure people tolerating or not tolerating price increases might be a good factor as to where they wind up setting them. I feel like for me, perhaps the best argument as to why a bit of irritation at Games Workshop price rises is kind of justified is just how profitable Games Workshop are at the moment. Obviously, they're a business with shareholders, and it's kind of their responsibility to maximise shareholder returns, but at the same time, their manufacturing costs are really quite tiny. Their revenue is something along the lines of £500 million or so, and out of that, they managed to take in a pretty humongous £200 million profit pre-taxation. So it is kind of safe to say that they could knock off a little bit of money off every single kit that they sell, and it probably wouldn't change too much in terms of them. They still have loads and loads of money to invest, grow and develop their business, and pay lots of dividends to shareholders, no doubt. There is also the argument that as you reduce the prices, you probably sell a fair few more model kits to people who couldn't afford it otherwise, though I guess there'd be some sort of people at Games Workshop to try and make the calculation as to the sweet spot for getting the most money out of people, setting prices high enough so that you're getting the maximum amount of money out of everyone, but not so high that you're turning people away from the hobby en masse, as that would also eat into profits as well. From a hobbyist perspective, though, I feel like a lot of people will be kind of happy to see things swing a little bit further to the low price Warhammer end of the spectrum that they could credibly do. I feel like for all the attention it seems to get at the time when Games Workshop do increase prices, it probably doesn't actually change the buying decisions of that many hobbyists, unless you have become jaded to the point where that was the straw that broke the camel's back, and you wind up looking to change things in a major way, like picking up a 3D printer, or deliberately trying to slow down purchases, or find models made by other suppliers. I feel like for people who are likely to be keeping on buying Warhammer things, the usual each year price changes probably aren't quite big enough to justify massively changing spending habits. I guess in theory, if you were say buying one Warhammer kit a month, it might make sense to buy a little bit more just before the price update and then skip out on a few months after. But in reality, it's probably not really worth overthinking too much, as you don't want a relatively small 5% discount to be the thing that leads to you buying a model kit that you wouldn't have otherwise bought and didn't really necessarily need that much, particularly if you've already got a big backlog, and no doubt Games Workshop will continue the release rollout and there'll be new shinies to tempt people later. I think from my point of view, perhaps the most obvious thing to not do, though, is just to put in a massive order of loads of plastic and things just literally after the price rise happens, as that feels like probably a bit of better planning could have saved you at least 5% on that order or something. At least Games Workshop do tend to give people a heads up when it's happening and give people a few weeks to plan. I guess it's somewhat in their interests as well, maybe makes them look a little bit less bad than otherwise, and also acts as a bit of a catalyst for sales for people who maybe do have a bit less self-control and go out and spend a lot of money due to prices rising by a little bit. In any case, let me know your thoughts as to Warhammer's price rises over the past few years. Have they affected your buying decisions in any way? And do you think that we'll get one for 2025 or not? Look forward to hearing all your thoughts down in the comments as normal. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep these coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.